it's not that individual becomes God. No. If we break it down to this plain English, there is only God playing individual very authentically. But then crescendo is being reached, some kind of cathartic in the performance itself. And the protagonist needs to rediscover himself. So then this whole thing, and the stage, of course, the music, the fragrance, the fire, the elements is all Shakti. The very, very theater of it all is Shakti, where Shiva plays this lila with himself, and by virtue of self-recognition, through the catharsis of becoming the individual, he reclaims his own status. God remains God. Nothing happened to God. Nothing ever happened to awareness. All scriptures, without exception, agree on the importance of the awakening of the heart, and it is the awakening of the internal organ here that we speak of. So in addition to that understanding, when you will come across these passages, whether they're direct, indirect, dressed in metaphor, or explicitly speaking to certain processes, the state of Antahkarana, irrespective to where we are in life, is considered to be at a given, a must for life to be lived in the balanced state. So in a way, we could say is that when the Antahkarana here, primarily influenced by the energies of lower mind, as it is, effectively speaking, mind infused with the sense of I maker, right? That egoic consciousness, as it's been dubbed in modern day spirituality, that ahamkara, then we are rooted in the physicality of our existence, whether we like it or not. We are like a tree in a way. Our erroneous perception of where we are rooted is in the physicality of this world. Therefore, identity here with the body is only a natural phenomenon, a natural outcome. So we don't have anyone to blame here. This is all happens at the level of the inner heart. Whereas the goal here, if we are to kind of really give it a very simple, accessible, direct analogy, is to reroot ourselves in the domain where we are actually gaining provenance. So in other words, we are not rooted in the earth as a tree, but as a human being we are rooted in the sky of consciousness. So this is kind of like a, I don't know if it's playful enough analogy. And that here literally what the role and place of the Antahkarana here. Because scriptures refer to it as the seat of all emotions and feelings, of all mental modifications. This is where we emote and relate. Our capacity to relate is to the degree of how awakened is our Antahkarana. So we could say that it's a necessity for every human being to have Antahkarana enlivened, awakened. And for that, of course, whatever the methodologies are, whatever they are, in this case, in this particular instance, it is not important. What is important is that it creates the possibility for that switch, shift to take place, so that the lower mind, which is arrested by the incessant activity of the senses and constantly taken outward, effectively speaking, out of its seat, if we examine and bring some other yogic kind of understanding. Mind here in its high aspect represents sattva. Sattva. Whereas senses are expression of raja guna, rajas, with the physiology itself as the body is an expression of tamaguna. So the relationships here is seen very clearly. So if we do not rest in that what is our essence, even at that level of creational order, which is sattva, then we don't rest at all. There is no rest for a wicked, that English proverb. We are simply constantly thrown in a spin of raja, guna, and constantly then land into the maya and viscosity of that, what tamaguna here represents, because there's not enough sattva. Sattva is equilibrium, that's what balances it all. It's a sense of equipoise, equilibrium. So the mind in its higher essence is sattva, but the lower mind is too much engrossed and involved in the activity of the senses, becomes, or rather loses that, and mind becomes rajasic, and it further gets engrossed into the bodily activity, and then it's also gains tamasic qualities. So yogically speaking, if you will, it is a no-no situation, a no-no, because then all these unpleasant outcomes, depression, inertia, lack of anything what we call vital living, lack of sense of purpose, and as an outcome of the dominance of Tama, the propensity to constantly fulfill the lack of fullness and equilibrium by virtue of being in action, in activity all the time, the chief property of Rajaguna. So mind needs to regain its sanity, full stop. And that is represented by higher mind taking over the lower mind. So this is where the order of that quadruple order out of which the organ is made gives that possibility for the shift in perception. And this can only be achieved in our day and age through skillful practice of meditation, as has been confirmed by so many people for millennia. It's the easiest and most direct way. Reasons for that have been further expounded through the insights into samyama, as you recall. Samyama has been spoken about as that togetherness of concentration, meditation, and integration, which is required in any activity anyway. It required in any activity with eyes open, when we go about our daily life. It is required and in action when we close our eyes and go inward. So all this was, of course, spoken also in view of giving this further understanding of this relationship between absolute, for which we use this potent term Shiva, and Shiva's embodiment as manifestation, as this reality we all partake in sharing. Because all this goes into creating greater understanding so that we can then allocate our otherwise perhaps fragmented experiences, insights, and so forth into a more of an orchestrated view and more of an orchestrated perspective. This perspective, which of course has value in its own right, I hope you have this somehow savored also the beauty in a sheer structure, beauty in a sheer outline, which is undoubtedly there. And finally, all this was so as to take another dive into the theme of Samavesha, which is very complex, open to polemics, has always been open to polemics, even back in the days when Samavesha, as we have acknowledged, has been incorporated by Shaivites of the Trika, particularly system, into its body of work, into its body of understanding, into its epistemological and ontological points of view. In contrast, and often in disagreement with the prevalent, more orthodox schools and systems of the day. For example, some of the works of its contemporaries, the sages that I'm speaking about now, of Kashmir Shaivism, who lived circa 10th century. The attacks were made that the Shaivites here playing with fire, that they, by introducing this concept of Samavesha into and legitimizing it because of its long-lived association with that term avesha, which literally means possession, and all the undesirable consequences of what that term represents, because from the more orthodox perspective, it was always associated with spirit possessions by some spirits. So therefore, in a country like India, it had always this problematic perspective and attitude towards that, to which we spoke yesterday, to some point to give us that overview and link that both historical and also from the perspective of what this particular work, this particular container is characterized by. The audacity and the genius of the proponents, the masters of this tradition, was to refute these arguments, all based on their personal experience, because the tradition here has been awashed to realign itself towards Gnostic view. So nothing was taken at the face value. Nothing was taken simply at the level of belief system. It had to be verified directly. And it just happened that some of its masters, the aforementioned and often mentioned by us, Abhinavagupta was one such master who was incomparable in terms of his ability to win any argument with any of the opponents, because he would always supplement this with his own first-hand experiences. And that's what made it so poignant. This what enriched tradition, revived it, sustained it, and gave it the impetus to be carried onwards. So the main here proposition was to literally use the term possession by giving it that upside down, that turn, flipping it, literally flipping it from what it represented in with respect and with regard to these psychic possessions by various spirits, to the meaning of that in relation to non-dual understanding that all this is Shiva, all this is awareness. So literally the goal of the one who is set to liberate himself here is to be immersed in universal consciousness. So this trinity of comprised of, right, Shiva, Shakti, Nara here, Nara that represents here individual consciousness is meant to immerse itself into the universal consciousness of Shiva. And that immersion is Samavesha. So this is the convergence of the meanings of Samavesha when it is translated and spoken of in terms of immersion, in terms of possession, and in terms of penetration. All of which we have touched upon in the series of these ongoing live events, starting with one in Mexico last year and continuing with this theme in Poland earlier this year. And this particular immersion was meant to represent another dive into this theme. Where do we draw the line? How do we distinguish between this, what is here a possession by a deity, and the most direct way to understand this is just as it was spoken now. It's literally, it's immersing of individual consciousness into universal consciousness. So this is where Shiva, as it were, undergoes that transfiguration back to regain his status. This is, in a nutshell, in the most succinct way to speak of the entire proposition of Shaiva Tantras. This is what exemplified by that term Jivan Mukta, or indeed, when speaking about it in terms of not a process, but in terms of a state, Samavesha. Because as some of you remember, we spoke about Samavesha as, from epistemological point of view, as a process, and we spoke about Samavesha from ontological point of view as a state. So perhaps it would be good to bring the distinction and understanding for you to reflect on this. When is it a process? And how and when the process turns into a state? How is it applicable to our daily life? What are the repercussions? How does it work? So, we pose these questions and make, let's say, a little departure to what has been an attempt, because it is still an attempt, to speak in an accessible way to some of what I have personally realized to be the most refined aspects in this particular philosophical system, which were in direct sync with my own experiences. And also, this is where it is extraordinary, not just experiences, but actually deeply held, intuitively supported views on what really this whole ordeal, if we call it an ordeal to a point, represents. And I've tried to put it in this series of digestible expressions in the book Chamatkara, The Hidden Path, where spiritual even landscape of India was given that perspective, that overview as an art performance. So almost like seeing every specific performance, theatrical performance, dance performance, and of course when we speak about the birth of Indian arts, we know that all arts originated from drama, from theater, in exactly the same way as it was in Greece. It was all under the open skies. They didn't build enclosure. They were all performed, as it were, in the domain of nature, under the direct observation of the gods, under the vault of the sky. And this open theater, that performance here, encompassed in itself all forms of art that yet to find themselves springing forth, diversifying in various different ways, how we know them even today, now. All of them were encompassed in drama. Art of gesture, movement, dance, music, all of that, painting, of course, colors, was incorporated into that, into one act. And this in itself could be seen as a replica of the entire leitmotif of Indian culture. It's like Indian culture is this grand ongoing performance. I don't know if it was suggested. I don't know if Peter Brook meant that when he staged his Mahabharata, and the premiere of Mahabharata was actually taking place in India and purportedly took several days to perform, using real water, real fire, in the landscape, with an audience invited from all over the world, and it was produced for TV and exists there. So this act, this performance, this theatrical performance here is given this macrocosmic and microcosmic analogy. So this, what happens in Indian culture, Indian civilization, could also be viewed as this grand performance where everyone plays their respective roles, not dissimilar to the way it is performed or used to be performed on stage. This is of particular significance because what I'm trying to do now is to draw a parallel for greater understanding, whilst at the very same time bring in some very important distinctions. So Samavesha, it is taking part in certain subtly orchestrated performance. There are aspects of performance, and what makes it a real Samavesha versus mood-making, pretending, is the authenticity of an act. And that authenticity of an act, of course, is the authenticity of being taken over. Not a casual, I'm Kali, or I'm Mahasaraswati, or I'm Mahalakshmi. It's not an Instagram post where hijacked by, feminist movement in spiritual circles, declaring this, I'm Kali. This is the grossest misrepresentation of what Samavesha actually represents. The same like the guy will exclaim, I'm Shiva. You are just confirming the other way around, because it can only happen if you are transported, if that individuality is taken over, even if for a duration of that performance. So this performance here is an authentic act of being taken over. This is an illusion. And what now distinguishes here the ontological perspective, from epistemological one, is that Samavesha remains to be a process and might be even limited to occasional experiences of being taken over, because there are a lot of components lacking for it to be subtly and fully incorporated into the fabric of one's awareness. So therefore it remains to be an isolated experience which only takes place when a proper stage is created, when a proper circumstances is set in motion. So in other words, one is there transported without even having to do much about it. There are some other, we should leave room now, there are some other aspects here which are linked to the esoteric dimension of what all these terms of various kinds of initiations represent. What is officiating the process and how it is all linked. Let's just leave this for a moment. And Samavesha can only become once lived reality, once lived state, when it's no longer a process, when, effectively speaking, that immersion into universal consciousness is complete. And when that takes place, it is irreversible as well, because the power now, that very same power that has created the possibility of this unique personal experience, is acting now in its full measure for it to be what it is. So you can simply reflect on this from that perspective. So in other words, it's no longer within the power of individual to reclaim its individuality. Do you see what I mean by that? So it's not that individual becomes God. No. If we break it down to this plain English, there is only God playing individual very authentically. But then crescendo is being reached, some kind of cathartic in the performance itself. And the protagonist needs to rediscover himself. So then this whole thing, and the stage, of course, the music, the fragrance, the fire, the elements is all Shakti. The very, very theater of it all is Shakti, where Shiva plays this lila with himself, and by virtue of self-recognition, through the catharsis of becoming the individual, he reclaims his own status. God remains God. Nothing happened to God. Nothing ever happened to awareness. So this is a kind of how I tapped into this and understand in my own way. So this recognition here is never in terms of individual cognizes something bigger than himself. If you reflect on this, you will see why that is not what is taking place. That's why it is called pratyabhijna. It's recognition, doctrine of recognition. When you recognize something in English language, it means you knew it before. Is it not? This is the grammar of the language. This is plainly clear. We're not becoming someone else. We're becoming who we are. That's the drama that Shiva plays upon himself, for the sake of his own sport, as very often is being given that kind of sweeping perspective, so as to also destroy any arguments in favor of duality. So, what is it then in practical terms at work here? This is very would be preposterous on our part to speak about it. Perhaps my attempt to respond to the last inquiry of our evening yesterday could have been left without much elaboration, because any attempt at putting every dot on I would defeat the purpose and perhaps serve potentially, not necessarily insisting, to counter that what needs to go anyway. So in other words, our attempt at rationalizing and understanding Samavesha in its full measure already doomed, or at least rooted in a bias that we want to have our cake and eat it too. It's like that very old good reminder. So Samavesha can only take place authentically when that structure is taken over by a more refined structure. As simple as that. And in that state, or in that process, the individual, as it were, recedes, and the powers that empower individual from behind the scenes, as all those Shaktis, impulses of creative intelligence, have a free play now. So this is why, if we to give it, let's say, this another complete additional perspective of how it's been viewed here, which also where that Shakta Samavesha of Shaivism is in agreement with the classical yogic understanding in terms of the way consciousness here functions, in terms of these three relative states and the transcendent. So this access into the transcendent, this what is represented here by Turiya, takes over by virtue of that what is a subject of rotating frequencies, of coming and going, here recedes. And in Turiya we experience, effectively speaking, that continuum in an unbroken manner. Of course it has this further gradations, of which we always bring as a reminder, so that we can speak about the full establishment in the transcendent leads to Turiyatita, the state beyond, and it further could be characterized by refinement of perception as that God consciousness, starting from cosmic God and unity. So we can also speak about it in relation to Shakta Samavesha here, because the individual here, in terms of its immersion, there are categories of that immersion. And we spoke about it. We have a beautiful video out there entitled Triple, I think, Samavesha, where distinction is given between individual-based, Shakta-based, and Shiva-based Samaveshas. So this, in relation to that trinity out of which experience is made, knower, knowing, and known. So whenever this trinity is intact, and this trinity here is, of course, what gives this dynamic vibrancy to all and how we experience everything, where the emphasis is. At some point in the highest Samavesha, all of them are fused. In other words, there is a fusion. And this fusion first proceeds from either gradual or more instantaneous collapse of what knower represents and the known. So in other words, it is something which can be experienced and is experienced by all of you when knower and the known gain such intimacy that only the knowing remains. So in other words, frequency of Shakti here is all there is. And whatever it is then represented in terms of phenomenal activity, how it expresses itself, it's that state of flow, when the doer goes and an act goes. So there's a complete flow. And that state of flow is characterized, we could say with quite some certainty, this is what taking place in and during the extraordinary display of any kind of activity. When, let's say, there is just running, just swimming, just that what is represented by the quality of Shakti here, right? In that trinity. But in the full Samavesha, the fusion of the three is such that they become indistinguishable, absolutely indistinguishable. And so that what brings that complete immersion, which is no longer can be even spoken in terms of what Shiva, Shakti and Nara here represents. It cannot be spoken in terms of the constituency of this what goes to make experience. So what is it then? What is it? This literally is when Samavesha is no longer a process but a state. The immersion is complete. And this is irreversible. And in that, the fusion of all these qualities then have this very, very interesting results in a very interesting, let's say, display of how consciousness operates. Upon regaining that, from experiencing that complete immersion, this, what in any other circumstances are standing and performing their own respective, let's say, jobs, no longer in any way overshadow that what took place during the time of fusion. So it is another perspective on why in Kashmir Shaiva scriptures there is this astonishing analogies given by Abhinavagupta, by Jayanatha, by Ksemaraja, each in their own way, that what is the source of perpetual bondage for an ignorant is now the source of perpetual reminder of his state of unity with Brahman or with Shiva or with Bhairava. So, and that was spoken in last year in this immersion. So even when sensory experiences are all intact, every experience is a conformation rather than being taken out into the sphere of division. So in other words, this is why Kashmir Shaivism is positively spoken in terms of true non-dual system. There's no room left whatsoever for making any distinction from manifested reality as this world of forms and phenomena, and that what is at the source of that manifestation. So the world itself is the body of Shiva. So each time any experience takes place, any experience, any experience, most obvious experience that happens at the level of the senses in the waking state, is only a continued confirmation of one's state of oneness. This is not something that can be verified, scrutinized. It's only open to experience. And this is why there are no such thing as one lives life in a state of some kind of altered consciousness anymore. All this, what prior to that, let's say, led to this, collapses utterly and entirely. Why? All the tattvas collapse back into Shiva. All the tattvas collapse back into Shiva. So they mean no longer what they represent in terms of the manifestation, and this what then acts as a limitation. The only limitation here, which is also acknowledged, is that as far as one remains in the physical body, 5 kanchukas are operating there. That is why, let's say, it will be an exaggeration to say that a completely liberated Sibyl or sage has this omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, all five qualities that have been consciously thrown upon itself by Shiva. And you can reflect on this, why that is. Because even in that state, Shiva remains in his own Maya. Even when tattvas collapsed into Shiva, he is embodied. If, and there are hidden pockets, of course, there are ways of, even in Tantrism certainly, in yoga, if one has no interest in living whatsoever, one can simply exit the body through one of the pathways by the force of one's own awakened prana. But if in the body, then Shiva respects the order he created in the first place. So he doesn't drive on a red light, right? It doesn't smoke on the airplane if it's no smoking airplane, and so forth. So that should give you also that understanding of what to expect and what not to expect, what to here have clarity about, so that there's no speculation, because this is subtle, very, very subtle. So we could touch these states of unity, and we can certainly repeatedly go into that, what Samavesha here represents. And it will continue in that state of performance. And the reasons for that are the sum total is greater than its parts. Why that is. So perhaps we could put a pause here, because I find it not only because of the constriction of time, which is the working of one of the kanchukas right now, but it seems inconsistent with the theme itself to come up with any conclusive statement. So at best we should leave it open.